Hey guys, let's talk about Resident Evil. If you're into video games and you clicked on this video, you probably have some idea of what this series is. But just in case you don't, Resident Evil is probably the most successful survival horror franchise ever to exist. In fact, if I understand correctly, it was the creators of Resident Evil who first coined the term survival horror. So suffice it to say, this franchise has had a pretty significant effect on the world of horror games. And as you'd expect with a series this successful, there have been a boatload of adaptations, from Hollywood movies to shows on streaming services, and of course to today's topic, the animated films. I guess you could debate whether or not these could be considered anime, but for the purposes of this video, that's how I'm going to characterize them. What makes the anime films stand apart from other adaptations is that they're meant to exist within the same universe as the games. So if you've played Resident Evil or any of its sequels and you want to spend a little more time in the game's universe, the anime films are usually your best bet. And I say usually because unfortunately not every Resident Evil anime is created equal. And that brings us to today's subject, Resident Evil Vendetta. This film is pretty notorious among fans for being the worst of the anime adaptations, specifically because of how it treats the world and characters. Especially toward the end of the film, the plot introduces a few elements that are straight up world-breaking and that have some fairly undesirable implications for the in-game universe. But in order to get into that, we need to examine the film a little more closely. So without further ado, let's dive right into the strange, zombie-ridden world of Resident Evil Vendetta. So our plot kicks off promisingly enough with Chris Redfield and a group of soldiers heading out on a mission. They're already in the chopper and have almost reached their destination, so you'd assume that they would already be briefed on what they're doing and who they're after. But their commanding officer, I guess, realizes that the audience needs to be filled in, so he starts outlining their mission objectives. Apparently Chris's team is looking for a weapons dealer named Glenn Arias who's gotten his hands on a bioorganic weapon, or BOW. They're also looking for an undercover BSAA operative and her son who've gone missing. And I can never remember what BSAA stands for, so we'll just say it's the Bullshit Association of Assholes. Trust me, by the time the movie is over, you'll agree that it's a fitting name. Once the audience is all caught up, the chopper lands and the team heads to the mission site in a scene that's fairly reminiscent of the original Resident Evil game opening. We see the soldiers making their way through the woods and eventually come upon a huge, creepy mansion. They head inside and start sweeping the place, which again is pretty reminiscent of the Arkley mansion in the first game. The team splits up, because of course they do, and one group ends up getting a fake-out scare with a little motorized toy car. The filmmakers try very hard to make this scene tense, with the toy being activated a few times and the soldiers just staring on at it like a group of Neanderthals, wondering what's going on. They then spot a small figure in the corner of the room who's covered in blood and is very obviously a zombie. The kid very slowly approaches the soldiers, who again just stand staring at him and even start lowering their guns. Keep in mind, this isn't some kind of secret zombie outbreak. The opening made it very clear that the soldiers were well aware of the likelihood that they'd be facing zombies during this mission. But they just stand and stare as the kid slowly raises his head, giving the audience a good look at the gore effect on his face before attacking the soldiers. So my question is, why was the zombie behaving this way? Why didn't it just attack the soldiers the minute they entered the room? I guess it was just very important that we have that fake-out scare with the toy truck, even if it means that the zombies' actions make no sense. And this happens again a minute later, too. Chris and his team enter the same room after the first group has been killed and find the place silent and empty. They approach the bed the toy truck is sitting on, and it's only then that a horde of zombies attacks from beneath the bed, growling and groaning and generally making a huge ruckus. So, are these stealth zombies? Why were they hiding under the bed to begin with? And why weren't they making any noise? Well, I guess those are stupid questions. Pretty much all of the soldiers end up being either killed or infected, leaving Chris alone among a growing horde of the undead. He escapes the situation by diving out of a window, but when he hits the ground he runs straight into Glenn Arias. Remember him from the briefing? Chris and Arias then have a fight scene, and credit where credit's due, the choreography here is actually very tight and effective. Arias pretty much wipes the floor with Chris, and without a word of dialogue manages to establish himself as a serious and credible threat. That is, until the fight scene is over. Once Chris has been defeated and Arias has managed to disarm him, things should end pretty quickly, right? Well, you'd think so. But instead of shooting Chris in the head and eliminating him as a threat, Arias decides to monologue about his BOW business.
Thanks to you, I'll have to move my business somewhere else.
You son of a bitch!
Please. I'm a businessman. I make good products available to anyone who wants to buy. And at reasonable prices. For example, this exquisite specimen.
This is our introduction to Arias' henchmen, whose names I can't remember. I guess we'll just call them Bane and Poison Ivy. They've got a zombie lady with them who Chris recognizes as the BSAA operative he was sent to rescue. Arias then says this.
The wonderful thing about my products is that they know the difference between ally and enemy.
And sorry, how? Zombies are still caused by the T virus, right? Or I guess the A virus in this case. But how can a virus tell a zombie who's a friend and who's a foe? Well, no time to explain because a horde of zombies just appears out of nowhere and starts gunning for Chris. But just when all seems lost, the BSAA helicopter appears to make short work of the undead. The sequence ends with Chris holding the body of the woman he was sent to rescue, screaming out a melodramatic, "No!" And now, almost 20 minutes into this hour-and-a-half long movie, we get our title card and opening credits. Once that's over, the film gives us some background on our antagonist. We get a flashback to Arias' wedding, where everything seems to be going fine until a plane comes out of nowhere and drops a bomb on the ceremony. Arias rises from the ashes to find everyone he loves dead. How did he survive the blast when everyone else was killed? Never explained. We then get our second melodramatic "no" in the space of less than 5 minutes. Fast forward to the present, where Arias is standing dramatically over, I think, the city of New York. In case we're too dumb to understand the flashback, he just announces to literally no one that his motivation for doing everything he's doing is his dead wife. Everyone got that? Okay, good. Moving on. We next find ourselves at a university in Chicago 4 months later. Inside, we see Rebecca Chambers, who has apparently retired from the police force and is now working as a scientist trying to find a cure for the zombie virus. She and a colleague of hers discuss the fact that a number of zombie outbreaks have occurred across America, but that the government is covering them up so that the general public doesn't panic. They then discuss an experimental drug that the university is developing to counteract the zombie virus. And again, credit where credit is due. If nothing else, Resident Evil Vendetta at least looks really nice. For a film that was made in 2017, I think that the visuals hold up quite well, especially when it comes to character movement and facial expressions. The scene with Rebecca really highlights how well the filmmakers were able to capture small, subtle details in the characters' faces and body language. And this is something that we see at various points throughout the film with various characters. So yeah, I definitely say that the visuals are one of this movie's greatest strengths. Anyway, back to the terrible writing. Rebecca's colleague leaves the room to check on some infected bodies that the university has had delivered, but along the way he's attacked and killed by Poison Ivy. The university's power is then cut as Poison Ivy pumps some kind of zombie gas through the ventilation system. Everyone inside is infected, including Rebecca, but remember that experimental drug that she was just conveniently discussing with her colleague? Well, she manages to drag herself over to the room where it's being developed and administers it before she turns. And this just begs the question, how did Rebecca know that she was turning into a zombie in the first place? All she saw was some strange gas appearing through the ventilation system. She didn't even see any zombies on her way to the room where the drug was being developed. So why would she immediately connect the gas with becoming a zombie? Why would she assume that it's suddenly airborne? I mean, we know it is because we're the audience and we saw what Poison Ivy was up to, but how did Rebecca know? But wait, it gets even more confusing. Rebecca ends up getting attacked by some zombies, but just before they're able to overtake her, Chris shows up and takes them out. He's accompanied by some fellow BSAA operatives, and none of them are wearing masks or hazmat suits or any kind of gear at all that would protect against a virus. So why didn't any of them turn? The The whole facility was pumped full of zombie gas just 5 minutes ago, which doesn't seem like much time for a highly contagious airborne illness to dissipate. Well, whatever. Chris gets Rebecca to safety, and a little later on tells her about Arius. The two piece together that he was behind the attack on the university, and then we get this exchange.
I compared the new virus's DNA to all the bioweapons we have on file. The sequence is extremely close to the parasitic weapons used by the Los Illuminados cult.
And, okay, so the parasitic weapons that she's talking about are obviously the plagas. But how does that make any sense? How would an airborne man-made virus have any similarities with an ancient, blood-borne parasite? Well, I guess it doesn't matter, because the only reason this plot point is here is to give the characters an excuse to recruit Leon. And honestly, Leon Kennedy is my favorite Resident Evil character, so I'm not going to complain too much on that front. What I will complain about, though, is the state that Chris and Rebecca find him in. The pair track Leon down to some kind of resort in Colorado where he's sitting around indulging in liquor and self-pity. When they try to tell him about the Arius situation, he refuses to hear them out because he's too busy feeling sorry for himself over the fact that his life hasn't turned out the way he wanted it to. He also mentions that his previous mission was a complete failure since one of his teammates turned out to be a traitor and ended up getting everyone but Leon killed. So basically, Leon has taken a page out of Chris's book from Resident Evil 6. You'd think that since Chris has been there, he'd have some insightful words for Leon, but instead he just berates him for his behavior. Chris then gives Leon and the audience some exposition about our antagonist.
Look, this is Glenn Arias, an arms dealer. His deals on the black market are so shady they landed him on a certain government's hit list. A smart bomb was dropped on his wedding. He lost his family and his wife. And now, he's got a grudge. After the attack, he went underground. But now he's back with BOWs and a score to settle.
So I guess the Vendetta in Resident Evil Vendetta refers to Arius' grudge. Also, I love how they never specify which government bombed his wedding. Chris just says that Arius ended up on a certain government's hit list and doesn't give us any more details than that. Next we get this exchange.
So you got an arms dealer on one side, and on the other, the government dropping bombs on weddings. Who's the bad guy here?
Arias! And it's our mission to bring his ass down!
Your mission, not mine.
God damn it, Leon!
Stop! Leon, with everything that's going on, you just sit here and feel sorry for yourself. And you're letting a grudge get the better of you.
And, okay, so there's a lot to unpack here. Rebecca's not wrong about Leon, but Chris? How is he letting a grudge get the better of him? Yes, he's passionate about his mission and he wants to take Arius down, but considering everything we've seen of Arius and what he's capable of, how is that such a bad thing? Does she just expect Chris to remain cold and emotionally detached from his mission while people die and turn into zombies all around him? I guess what the filmmakers were trying to establish is that just as Arius has a grudge against the world's governments, Chris is starting to develop a grudge against Arius. But rather than taking the time to show us this grudge developing, we're just told that it's there and expected to accept it. Leon also mentioned the government and its part in all this, which touches on a pretty interesting issue that I wish the film delved into a little more. In the Resident Evil universe, you've got zombies and other bioorganic weapons being developed by capitalist institutions like Umbrella. And you've also got governments seeking to use Umbrella's technology to develop weapons for their own geopolitical purposes. There could be a really interesting debate here about weapons dealing and about the roles that capitalism and big government play in the economy of war. But this is all brushed aside pretty quickly so that Rebecca can reveal this.
The virus is right under our noses. Always has been.
I don't follow.
We don't need to look for some new virus that Arius is infecting people with. The virus is lying dormant inside of everyone. Even you.
Sorry, what? Since when? And how does she know this? Well, whatever. After berating the pair a little more, Rebecca goes to, I guess, take a shit and is ambushed in the bathroom by Poison Ivy. While she's gone, a man rushes into the resort begging for Leon's help. Remember how a few minutes ago Leon mentioned that a traitor on his last mission got everyone killed? Well, this is that guy. He claims to have some information on a huge bioterrorism attack that's being planned and says that his family is in danger because he knows too much. But while Leon and Chris are in the process of interrogating him, Bane shows up with some of Arias's men and starts shooting the place up. The guy who showed up begging for Leon's help ends up dying, and right afterward, Bane and Poison Ivy take off with Rebecca in tow. The scene ends with Leon finally digging his head out of his ass and agreeing to help Chris. And the next scene we get is definitely the silliest in the whole movie. Rebecca wakes up to find herself in a wedding dress, surrounded by zombies in coffins. Arias approaches her and reveals that he's recreated his wedding day with Rebecca as his bride and his dead friends and family reanimated as zombies. And the only reason he gives for choosing Rebecca is that she somehow, and very conveniently, looks nearly identical to his wife who was killed. That is quite the coincidence, and it's never explained. Worse still, this whole scene is completely pointless and contributes exactly nothing to the overall plot. I mean, I guess you could say that it establishes that Arias hasn't moved past the tragedy of his wedding day, but this is something we've already been told. Like, we get it, he misses his stupid dead wife. Can we move on? Anyway, while all this is happening, Leon and Chris use Rebecca's laptop to trace the location of the recent zombie attacks. They eventually determine that Arias is planning a massive strike on the city of New York. And remember that guy who ran into the resort begging for Leon's help? Well, again, very conveniently, it just so happens that he was working with Arias and that he had all of the details of Arias's plan on his phone, which Leon and Chris used to track down Arias's New York hideout where Rebecca is being held. Alright, so now we get to the film's exciting climax. And up until now there's been a lot of silliness in the story, but nothing world-breaking and definitely nothing worth getting genuinely annoyed at. All of that's about to change, though. While Leon, Chris, and a few BSAA operatives head to New York, Arias's men start flooding the city streets with zombie gas. Tons of people are infected, and pretty soon there are hordes of undead rampaging through New York. Our protagonists manage to locate the tankers that are pumping out the gas, and with reckless disregard for any civilians who might be nearby, they just start blowing the tankers up. The team is then attacked by a pair of zombie dogs, and this is where things start to get really bad. While Chris and the other BSAA members carry on with their mission, Leon uses himself as bait to lure the zombie dogs away. We then get an extended chase scene with Leon dodging and weaving through the city traffic, the zombie dogs hot on his heels. And honestly, it's a well-choreographed sequence. The animation is smooth and fluid, and Leon pulls off some genuinely impressive moves on his bike. It would be a fun little set piece were it not for his complete and callous disregard for the lives of anyone around him. I mean, look at this. He's opening fire in the middle of the road, directly into oncoming traffic. He's causing pile-ups, and at one point he even hurls a grenade over his shoulder, again, directly into oncoming traffic. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that he gets at least a dozen people either killed or badly wounded during this scene, which begs the question, wasn't saving people the whole point of coming to New York? Why bother saving the city from the zombie gas if Leon's just going to make a deadly menace of himself on the road? Cut to Chris, who's now making his way into Arias's hideout. Arias notices the intrusion, but instead of planning some kind of ambush for Chris, he instead starts monologuing over the building's PA system, gloating about his evil plan. He announces that he's infected Rebecca with a new form of the zombie virus, and is even nice enough to give Chris a timeline, stating that he has 20 minutes until Rebecca turns. Arias then releases some zombies to take Chris out, and we get an admittedly pretty cool little action sequence as he struggles to fight his way out of the horde. Leon eventually shows up as well, and we get another action scene as the pair fight to take out the remaining zombies. Again, this part of the film is pretty well executed, and if all of the action scenes were like this one, I wouldn't have nearly as much complaining to do about the movie. Eventually, Chris and Leon decide to split up again so that Chris can look for Rebecca. He finds her pretty much immediately, so that's convenient. Before he's able to help her, though, Bane storms in and we get another fight scene as he and Chris square off. And honestly, the rest of the film is pretty much nothing but fight scenes. Chris manages to defeat Bane with an incendiary grenade before freeing Rebecca. The pair end up on the facility's roof for some reason, where it turns out that Arias is waiting for them. He and Chris have yet another fight scene, which culminates in Arias being thrown through a window and plummeting to his death. Well, almost. Just before he dies, Bane shows up, because I guess he's still alive, and Arias tells him to unleash the final stage. And this apparently consists of Bane and Arias melding together to form an admittedly pretty cool looking Resident Evil boss. He's even got a giant pulsing red heart that's obviously his weak spot, though it takes forever for the characters in the movie to notice it. Anyway, the Bane/Arius hybrid attacks Chris and manages to get the upper hand. But of course, instead of just crushing him like a bug, he takes his sweet time trying to kill him. And because he spends so long trying to take Chris out, he's interrupted by Leon. The two of them then have a fight scene, and for the second time, the boss manages to get the upper hand, but spends like 5 minutes gloating about how he's going to kill Leon instead of just, killing Leon. But remember the other BSAA operatives who were originally helping Chris and Leon with blowing up the tankers? Well, they're back, and just in time for hands down the worst scene in the movie. One of the operatives fires some kind of railgun at the boss, and just look at this. Like, holy shit, she just totaled how many buildings with that gun? I count at least 5 high-rises, and look at this, some of them even had their lights on, which had to mean there were people inside. So this lady just straight up murdered hundreds, if not thousands of people. And do you want to know the worst part? That railgun didn't even kill the boss. Yeah, he's fine, so the massacre that this lady just committed was completely pointless. The only thing she really achieved was getting the boss's attention. He leaps from the rooftop onto the helicopter, which gives Leon the chance to throw his motorcycle at him. And I guess the BSAA operatives inside the helicopter were extremely lucky that that massive explosion didn't take out a propeller or a wing or something. Once again, Leon shows a completely callous disregard for the lives of others. And that's really what's so frustrating about the entire climax of this film. I mean, say what you want about those Mila Jovovich movies, but from what I understand, those are at least meant to be in their own universe, with their own canon separate from the games. But you can't say the same for these animated movies. These are meant to exist in the game's universe. There are even points throughout the film that make direct references to characters and events that took place in the games. So when you have a scene like this where Leon's acting completely out of character, it just feels like character assassination. But wait, it gets worse. After being knocked off the helicopter by the exploding bike, the boss ends up dangling like Spider-Man between the chopper and a building, giving Chris time to get a shot off. Finally, he thinks to hit the boss in his weak spot, which causes him to explode and finally die. And again, it's a lucky thing for the BSAA operatives that this massive fireball doesn't damage the helicopter in any way. And with the boss defeated, Chris manages to find the cure for Rebecca's zombieism, which Arius conveniently just had lying around, I guess. He's able to administer the drug before she turns, and the film comes to a close with Chris, Leon, and Rebecca in the chopper pouring zombie cure all over the city. They keep referring to it as a vaccine, but this is not how vaccines work. Like, you don't take a vaccine after you're already sick. You take it as a preventative measure before you get sick so that you have all the antibodies you need to fight off an illness if you're exposed to it. But the filmmakers seem to conflate a vaccine with an antidote, so as the cure is poured over the city, we see people being turned back from zombies into normal people. And I guess this is all fine and good for those who haven't sustained any injuries, but what about the people who have? What about those with massive zombie bites or missing limbs or who've been otherwise messed up during the zombie outbreak? I guess all of them can just bleed out in the streets or something. Because as far as this film's framing is concerned, this is a happy ending, so roll credits. And that's Resident Evil Vendetta. So, final thoughts on the film. Well, overall I found it to be a hot mess, but kind of a lovable one. Sure, the writing is clunky, and yes, both Leon and the members of the BSAA come across like callous sociopaths who can't complete a mission without getting thousands of innocent people killed. And of course, having an airborne cure for the zombie virus pretty much breaks the entire world of Resident Evil. But one thing to keep in mind about these anime films is that by and large, they don't really take themselves too seriously. They're meant to be fun, cheesy action horror flicks and nothing more. And granted, Resident Evil Vendetta is the worst of the bunch, but even the worst of these films is still pretty enjoyable. As I mentioned before, the movie does at least look really nice, and the action scenes are also a lot of fun and are extremely well choreographed, for the most part. So, if you just want some mindless entertainment that lets you turn your brain off for a while, you could do much worse than this film. You just really have to turn your brain off, especially if you've played the games. But these are just my opinions. As always, I'd like to hear what you guys think. Do you like these Resident Evil anime films? Do you think I missed anything important in my analysis? I'd love to know in the comments. Until then, see you next time.